The ballroom glowed in soft gold light, every table dressed in white linen and pale roses, every glass catching the shimmer of chandeliers above. Nearly 200 guests filled the room, laughter blending with the soft hum of music as my younger sister Camille spun across the dance floor in her lace gown. From where I stood near the edge of the room, I watched her smile, wide, perfect, effortless, the kind of smile that made people believe in happy endings. I remember thinking how strange it felt to be there at all. Not unwelcome exactly, but not fully included either. Like a guest invited out of obligation. Not love. Then I saw my father walking toward the stage. At first, I didn't think anything of it. Fathers gave speeches at weddings. That was normal. Expected. But something about his stride felt wrong, too sharp, too deliberate. He didn't wait for the music to end. He didn't signal to the DJ. He simply reached out and grabbed the microphone. The sudden screech of feedback cut through the room like glass breaking. Everyone, listen closely. The music stopped mid-note. Conversations died in half-finished sentences. Heads turned. Forks paused halfway to mouths. The entire ballroom froze in place, suspended in silence. And then he said my name. Not warmly, not proudly, sharply. Like an accusation. He cleared his throat once, gripping the microphone tighter than necessary. "Before we continue this celebration," he said, his voice steady but loud enough to echo off the walls, "there's something I think everyone here deserves to understand." A ripple of unease passed through the crowd. I felt it before I saw it, the way people shifted in their chairs, the way their eyes began moving toward me without knowing why. My chest tightened. "I know today is supposed to be about family," my father continued. "About loyalty. About standing by each other when times get hard." He paused, scanning the room like he was measuring his audience. "And yet," he added slowly, "not everyone in this family understands what loyalty really means." Heat rushed into my face before I even realized what was happening. I stood there, frozen, as his gaze settled directly on me. "There was a time," he said, voice rising slightly, "when this family needed help, when our family business was struggling, when every hand mattered." A few guests shifted uncomfortably. Some turned fully toward me now. "And what happened?" he asked, leaning slightly toward the microphone. One person chose to walk away. A whisper rose somewhere behind me. "Who's he talking about?" My father didn't hesitate. "My daughter Naomi," he said clearly. "She walked away when we needed her most." The words struck like cold water poured over my head. For a second, I genuinely thought I had misheard him. But he kept going. "She left responsibilities behind," he continued. "She ignored warnings. She refused to help when our family business was on the edge of collapse." The room grew impossibly still. Strangers stared openly now. People I had never met, judging me, measuring me, deciding who I was based on his words alone. My hands felt numb at my sides. I forced myself to breathe, slow and steady, while every muscle inside me tightened. This wasn't a misunderstanding. This wasn't an emotional slip. This was deliberate, planned, rehearsed. He had chosen this moment, my sister's wedding, surrounded by nearly 200 witnesses, to rewrite history. And suddenly, I understood something that made my stomach twist. He wanted an audience, a public record, a story that could never be undone. I turned my head slowly, searching for Camille. My sister stood just a few feet away, still holding her bouquet. Her smile had vanished, replaced by something tight and pale. When my eyes met hers, she looked away immediately, fast, almost guilty. Her fingers tightened around the stems of white roses until her knuckles turned pale. She didn't speak, didn't interrupt, didn't defend me. That silence hurt more than my father's words. It told me everything I needed to know. She had known this was coming. A low murmur rolled through the guests now, quiet whispers, cautious glances. Someone near the front leaned toward another guest and whispered, "Is that his older daughter?" I swallowed hard, forcing myself to stay upright. My father kept talking, his voice steady, confident, as if he were delivering a carefully prepared presentation instead of dismantling me piece by piece. "Families survive because people sacrifice," he said. "Because they stay. Because they don't run away when things get difficult." Run away. That phrase echoed in my head like a hammer striking metal. Because it wasn't true. Not even close. I hadn't run away. I had left after discovering numbers that didn't make sense, records that vanished when I questioned them, ledgers that disappeared from locked cabinets overnight. But none of that mattered now. Not here. Not in front of this crowd. The damage was already happening. The story already forming. When he finally lowered the microphone, the silence that followed felt heavier than the speech itself. No applause. No music. Just stillness. And then, as if nothing had happened, the DJ cleared his throat and started the music again. Soft. Awkward. Forced. I felt movement beside me. My mother, she stepped closer, placing her hand lightly on my arm. Her grip wasn't comforting. It was controlled, steady, deliberate. "You've always been too sensitive," she whispered quietly, her voice calm enough that no one else could hear. Not, "Are you okay?" Not, "He shouldn't have said that." Just that, too sensitive. I looked at her, searching for some trace of regret. There was none, only quiet dismissal. That was the moment something inside me shifted. Not shattered. Not exploded. Shifted. Like a door closing quietly in the back of my mind. Without another word, I turned and began walking toward the exit. Past tables of guests pretending not to stare. Past relatives avoiding eye contact. Past strangers who suddenly knew my name for all the wrong reasons. No one stopped me. No one called after me. Not my mother. Not my father. Not even Camille. The heavy ballroom doors opened with a soft push, releasing me into the cool night air outside. The sound of music drifted behind me, louder now, laughter rising again as if the evening had already corrected itself, as if humiliation could be folded neatly into the background and ignored. I walked across the empty parking lot alone, heels clicking sharply against the pavement. Inside my chest, humiliation burned, but beneath it, something colder began forming, something sharper. By the time I reached my car, I wasn't crying. Not even close. I sat behind the wheel, gripping it tightly as the engine hummed to life beneath me. And as I pulled onto the dark highway, one memory rose to the surface, clear and undeniable. A missing financial ledger. Locked away months earlier. Gone the next morning. Not misplaced. Removed. Only 3 people had access to that cabinet. My father, my sister, and me. And as the road stretched endlessly ahead, illuminated only by headlights cutting through the darkness, I stopped wondering why he humiliated me in that ballroom, and started wondering what he was trying to hide. Morning sunlight forced its way through the thin motel curtains, sharp and unforgiving, landing directly across my face like a spotlight I hadn't asked for. For a moment, I didn't move. I just lay there, staring at the ceiling, still dressed in the same clothes I had worn to Camille's wedding. My heels sat crooked near the door. My purse lay open on the floor where I had dropped it sometime after midnight. Everything looked abandoned, like the room itself had given up on me. The silence was louder than anything from the night before. No music. No whispers. No accusing voice echoing across a ballroom. Just stillness. My phone buzzed once against the nightstand, the vibration sharp enough to make my stomach tighten. I reached for it slowly, my fingers stiff, half expecting to see Camille's name or my mother's number flashing across the screen. Some part of me, small and stubborn, still hoped someone would call to fix what had happened. But the screen showed something else. A notification from my bank. Low balance alert. I stared at the number longer than I should have. It wasn't catastrophic yet, but it wasn't comfortable either. 6 years of steady income from the family business had ended the moment I walked out of that ballroom, and the truth settled heavily in my chest. Not only was I alone emotionally, I was alone financially. I sat up slowly, rubbing my eyes, forcing myself into motion before doubt had time to grow roots. The air inside the motel room smelled faintly of stale carpet and cheap soap, the kind of smell that reminded you nothing here was meant to last. Neither was I. I stood and crossed to the small trash can near the door. The thin plastic bracelet from the wedding reception still circled my wrist. White. Flimsy. Meaningless. For a moment, I stared at it. Then I slipped it off and dropped it into the trash. The soft plastic hit the bottom with barely a sound. Still, it felt final. By mid-morning, I was driving again. Not toward home because I didn't have one anymore, but toward Spokane, Washington. A city far enough away to feel like distance meant safety. Far enough away that no one there knew my name or the version of me my father had created the night before. The highway stretched endlessly ahead, gray and empty under a pale sky. I didn't cry. Not once. By the time I reached Spokane, the exhaustion had settled deep into my bones. But I refused to let it slow me down. I signed a lease for the smallest apartment I could afford, a one-bedroom unit on the second floor of a quiet building that smelled faintly of detergent and fresh paint. The apartment itself felt hollow. Bare walls, single window overlooking a cracked parking lot. A kitchen small enough to cross in 3 steps. That first night, I sat on the floor because I hadn't bought furniture yet. My back leaned against the wall, and I listened to the unfamiliar sounds around me. Footsteps above. Pipes humming. Distant doors closing. Loneliness didn't creep in. It crashed. Later, while unpacking a single cardboard box, I found an old notebook wedged between folded clothes. I hadn't even remembered packing it. Curious. I flipped it open. My handwriting stared back at me immediately, tight. Precise lines filled with numbers and notes. Financial discrepancies. Vendor summaries. Internal audit reminders from my final months at the family business. One page stood out. A series of numbers circled in red ink. Next to them, I had written a single word. Mismatch. I traced the circle lightly with my finger, feeling a faint chill crawl up my arms. Those numbers had bothered me once, enough that I had stayed late nights reviewing reports, double-checking ledgers, searching for answers no one seemed interested in hearing, answers that disappeared when the ledger itself vanished. I closed the notebook slowly. Not now, I told myself. That chapter was over. Or at least, that's what I wanted to believe. The weeks that followed tested every ounce of strength I had. Job applications went unanswered. Emails remained unopened. Interviews ended with polite smiles and careful rejection. Why did you leave your previous position? One hiring manager asked during an early interview. I hesitated too long before answering. Because the truth sounded bitter, and bitterness made people uncomfortable. So instead, I gave half answers. Neutral explanations. Professional excuses that never felt convincing, not to them, and certainly not to me. Savings drained faster than I expected. Rent, groceries, gas. Each expense chipped away at the fragile safety net I had built over years of steady work. More than once. Dinner consisted of canned soup heated slowly in a dented pot, eaten alone at the kitchen counter under flickering light. Still, I kept moving. Eventually, a small accounting firm took a chance on me, temporary work. Low pay. Nothing permanent. But it was enough. Enough to breathe again. Enough to stay. One afternoon, while reviewing a client's expense reports, something caught my attention. A vendor invoice. Small discrepancy. Dates didn't match services listed. It was subtle, the kind of thing most people would skim past without noticing. But I noticed. I flagged it quietly and walked the file to my supervisor's desk. She scanned the page once, then twice, her brows knitting together. Most people miss details like this, she said slowly, glancing up at me with something new in her expression. Respect. That moment shifted something inside me. Not dramatically, not loudly, but steadily. From that day forward, I started noticing patterns others overlooked. Numbers that didn't line up. Transactions that felt wrong in ways I couldn't always explain. And over time, I learned something valuable. Fraud left fingerprints. You just had to know where to look. The holidays were the hardest. Thanksgiving arrived quietly, without warning. Grocery stores filled with families buying ingredients for large dinners. Parking lots packed with laughter and conversation. Meanwhile, I sat alone at my small kitchen table with a microwave meal cooling in front of me. The television played in the background, cheerful commercials filled with smiling families passing plates and sharing jokes. For a moment, I let myself imagine being back at the old house. Long table, loud voices, my father carving turkey, Camille laughing beside me. The memory faded quickly, replaced by silence. My phone buzzed suddenly against the counter. Hope rose instinctively, fast, sharp. Impossible to stop. I grabbed it immediately. Spam message. Discount coupons from a store I didn't recognize. Not family. Never family. That was the moment acceptance settled in fully. They weren't coming back, and I wasn't going back either. Months turned into years. I took night courses, learned new software systems, studied forensic accounting techniques until my eyes burned from staring at screens too long. Slowly, carefully, I built something new. Not a family, not a home yet, but a skill, a reputation. Clients began calling regularly. Businesses needing help identifying financial leaks. Companies desperate to understand where their money had gone. One evening, while reviewing transaction logs for a mid-sized client, a pattern caught my attention, repeating structures buried deep inside multiple accounts. The shape of it felt familiar, uncomfortably familiar. I leaned closer to the screen, narrowing my eyes. For a brief second, memory flickered at the edge of recognition. Something about those numbers, something about their structure. It reminded me of home. I ignored the feeling at first, pushed it aside, focused on the work in front of me. But late one night, as rain tapped softly against the office windows and the building sat empty around me, my computer chimed with a new notification. Incoming email. Unknown sender. Subject line. You were right. I froze. My hand hovered above the keyboard. Unmoving. Slowly. Cautiously. I clicked the message open. One attachment. No explanation. No signature. Just a file. Ledger revision, year 3. My breath caught in my throat as I opened it. The formatting hit me first. Exact column layout. Exact labeling system. Exact structure used by my family's company years ago. Whoever sent this knew me. Or worse, needed me. And as my eyes scanned down the page, one single transaction stood out immediately. Bold. Unmistakable. Wrong in ways I couldn't ignore. A transaction that should never have existed. Not then. Not now. Not ever. And in that moment, I understood something that made the room feel smaller around me. The past I thought I had escaped was reaching back. The gray morning light filtering through my office blinds made everything look colder than it really was. I hadn't slept much. The ledger file still glowed faintly on my computer screen, its columns of numbers staring back at me like accusations. My coffee sat untouched beside the keyboard, steam long gone. Forgotten hours earlier? I leaned closer to the screen again, scrolling slowly. The transaction line that had caught my attention the night before still sat there, perfectly aligned, perfectly formatted, perfectly wrong. The vendor name didn't exist in any legitimate registry I could find. But the formatting, the structure, the coding pattern buried inside the line, all of it was unmistakable. It was built using the exact internal template our family business had used years ago. That alone made my chest tighten. But what truly unsettled me was the timestamp. 2 days ago. 2 days. That meant this wasn't some forgotten relic from the past. It wasn't an old mistake resurfacing by accident. It was happening now. Still active. Still hidden. My finger hovered over the mouse as I traced the numbers again, line by line, searching for anything else I might have missed. That was when my phone buzzed sharply against the desk. The sudden sound made my shoulders tense. I glanced down. A name flashed across the screen I hadn't seen in years. Derek. My cousin? I stared at it for several seconds before opening the message. 3 words. He needs you. That was it? No greeting. No explanation. No detail. Just those 3 words. My throat tightened immediately. Because I knew exactly who he meant. My father. For a long moment, I didn't move. The room felt smaller, the air heavier, as if the walls themselves were waiting for my response. Wedding music echoed faintly in my memory, the screech of the microphone, the silence that followed, the weight of 200 strangers staring at me like I was something broken. He needs you. The words didn't feel like a request. They felt like a hook. I picked up the phone slowly and pressed Derek's number before I could talk myself out of it. He answered on the 3rd ring. Naomi. His voice sounded rough, thinner than I remembered. What happened? I asked, skipping any greeting. There was a pause on the line. A long one. You heard anything lately? He asked cautiously. My eyes flicked toward the ledger file still open on my screen. No, I said carefully. Why? Another pause. Then he exhaled heavily. Federal auditors showed up last week, he said. Out of nowhere. The words landed like stones dropping into still water. What do you mean, auditors? I asked. My voice steady despite the tightening in my chest. I mean government auditors, he said. They flagged some accounts, shut down transfers, asked questions nobody here could answer. I leaned back slowly in my chair. How bad is it? I asked. Silence filled the line again. Bad enough that shipments are frozen, Derek admitted. Bad enough that suppliers are refusing deliveries. My stomach twisted. Bad enough that the company was bleeding. Bad enough that someone had noticed. They keep asking about the old reporting system, he continued quietly. About records from years ago. Years ago. When I still worked there, my grip tightened around the phone. And guess what? Derek added, voice lowering slightly. They're saying your name again. My pulse quickened. What do you mean, my name? I asked. They think you were the last person to handle some of the earlier reports, he said. Some folks here, they're saying maybe you left because you knew something. A bitter laugh nearly escaped my throat, but I swallowed it. Of course they were blaming me. Even after everything. Where's Camille? I asked suddenly. The silence that followed felt different this time. Longer, uneasy. Derek. I pressed, my voice sharper now. Where is she? He hesitated again. She left the company a few months ago, he admitted finally. Left. My stomach tightened further. Why? I asked. I don't know, he said quickly. Nobody knows. She just packed up and went. Said she needed space. Needed space. Right before auditors arrived. Right before everything started falling apart. The pattern forming in my mind felt too precise to ignore. Naomi, Derek added quietly. Things are bad here. Real bad. I glanced back at the screen again, at the strange transaction. The impossible formatting. The ledger wasn't random. It was deliberate. Someone had sent it to me for a reason. You still there? Derek asked. Yes, I replied. You coming back? He asked carefully. The question hung between us. 6 years of silence. 6 years of distance. 6 years of building a life that didn't include them. Every instinct inside me screamed to stay away. Stay safe. Stay distant. But another voice, colder, sharper, pushed forward. The professional voice. The investigator. The woman I had become. I leaned forward slowly and reopened the ledger file, studying the line labeled Adjustment Reserve. That code. I remembered it clearly. Executive level reporting. Restricted access. Only a handful of people ever saw those numbers. Someone expected me to recognize it. Someone inside that company wanted me to see this. I'll come, I said finally. Derek exhaled audibly. Good, he said quickly. Good. They need you. No, I corrected quietly. They don't need me. There was confusion in his silence. I'm not coming back as family. I continued. I'm coming back as a consultant. Another pause. Then a slow, uncertain reply. Okay. After the call ended, I sat motionless for several seconds. Then another notification appeared on my screen. New email. Same unknown sender. I opened it immediately. One sentence. They don't know what you know? A chill slid down my spine. Someone inside that company believed I held answers. Or leverage. Either way, this wasn't just about helping anymore. This was about truth. Hours later, my car rolled slowly along the familiar Idaho highway, the horizon stretching wide and empty ahead of me. Every mile brought back memories I thought I had buried. The factory sign appeared in the distance first, faded paint, cracked edges, standing stubborn against the sky. But something new caught my attention immediately. A security gate. Tall metal bars blocking the entrance. That hadn't existed before. Not in my time. I slowed the car as I approached, studying the unfamiliar vehicles parked near the entrance. Black SUVs. Not delivery trucks. Not employee vehicles. Men in dark suits stood near the doorway, their posture stiff, their eyes scanning every arrival. Watching, waiting. I pulled into the parking lot slowly, the tires crunching softly against gravel. For a moment, I sat inside the car, gripping the steering wheel tightly. My pulse thudded steadily in my chest. This didn't feel like a family crisis anymore. It felt like something much bigger, much more dangerous. I stepped out of the car, the cold air biting sharply against my face as the factory doors opened ahead of me. And in that moment, one truth settled heavily in my chest. This wasn't just a return. It was an investigation. The metal doors groaned as they slid open, releasing a familiar smell of oil and dust that hit me like a memory I hadn't asked to relive. For a moment, I stood still just inside the entrance. The factory floor stretched ahead of me, loud with machinery but strangely tense beneath the noise. Workers glanced up from their stations as I stepped forward. Some recognized me immediately. Their eyes widened slightly before dropping back to their work. Others stared openly, curiosity mixing with unease. 6 years had changed this place. Not just the people. The feeling. Even the reception desk looked unfamiliar. A young woman sat behind it, tapping at a keyboard with careful precision. I didn't recognize her, and she clearly didn't recognize me. "Can I help you?" she asked politely. "I'm Naomi Whitaker," I replied. "I'm here to see Mr. Whitaker." The moment my last name left my mouth, something shifted in her expression, not recognition exactly, but awareness. "Of course," she said quickly. "They're expecting you." Expecting. That word carried more weight than it should have. I moved down the hallway slowly, my heels echoing against the polished floor. Every step felt heavier than the last. Not because I was afraid, but because everything around me felt wrong. Too quiet. Too careful. When I reached my father's office, the door stood slightly open. I pushed it gently and stepped inside. The room hadn't changed much. Same large desk. Same leather chair. Same framed photographs lining the shelves. But something inside the space felt thinner, like the air had been drained of confidence. My father stood behind the desk, staring down at a stack of papers. He didn't smile when he saw me. Didn't step forward. Didn't say my name the way he used to. Instead, he straightened slightly and nodded once. "You're here," he said. Not warmth. Not relief. Just acknowledgement. I replied evenly. He gestured toward the chair across from his desk. "Sit," he said. No hug. No apology. Just business. I lowered myself into the chair, studying his face carefully. Lines I didn't remember had carved deeper into his forehead. His shoulders looked heavier, as if the years had pressed down harder on him than I had realized. "We have a situation," he said, folding his hands together. "You probably already heard." "I heard enough," I replied. He exhaled slowly, rubbing his temple with tired fingers. "We need your help reviewing financial records," he continued. You understand the systems better than anyone. Not daughter. Not Naomi. Just someone useful. A consultant. The realization didn't sting the way it once might have. Instead, it settled quietly into place, confirmation of something I had already suspected. I'll review what needs reviewing, I said calmly. But I want full access. His eyes flickered briefly. Then he nodded. Fine. The word came too quickly, too easily. That alone made my suspicion deepen. When I stepped back into the hallway, my mother appeared almost instantly, as if she had been waiting just out of sight. Naomi, she said softly, moving toward me. Her arms wrapped around me before I had time to react. The hug felt tight, too tight, her fingers gripping the back of my coat like she was holding on to something fragile. We're glad you're here, she whispered. The words sounded rehearsed, measured, not emotional. I stepped back slowly, studying her face. She didn't mention the wedding, didn't acknowledge the humiliation, didn't ask how I had survived the years alone. Just smiled, thin and careful. That told me everything. Warmth wasn't comfort. It was strategy. I moved past her without another word, heading toward the accounting department. The room had changed drastically. New computers lined every desk. Updated systems glowed across large monitors. Even the layout felt unfamiliar, like someone had redesigned the entire space to erase what used to exist there. A man stood near the center desk, sorting through paperwork with quick, nervous movements. This is Lewis, my father said from behind me. Our senior accountant. Lewis turned, offering a stiff handshake. Good to meet you, he said. But his hand trembled slightly in mine. His eyes refused to hold contact longer than necessary. Fear. Not uncertainty. Fear. I'll need access to all transaction logs from the past 5 years, I said. Lewis froze for half a second, just long enough for me to notice. Then he nodded quickly. Of course, he replied, his voice tight. That hesitation spoke louder than any confession. I sat at one of the empty desks, logging into the system carefully. The interface looked different, newer software, updated design, unfamiliar shortcuts, system migration. Recent, too recent. I pulled up archived transactions and began scanning line by line. Minutes passed, then hours, and finally, there it was. A pattern. Small payments routed repeatedly to the same vendor. The amounts weren't large individually, but they repeated with strange consistency, always rounded, always timed perfectly at the end of reporting cycles. That wasn't coincidence. That was design. I clicked into the vendor details. Address: Reno, Nevada. Not a manufacturing hub, not a shipping partner, just a location. Something about it felt hollow. I leaned closer, narrowing my eyes as more records loaded across the screen. And then, my breath caught. Approval signature. Digital. Stamped clearly across the transaction. Camille Whitaker. My sister. For a moment, my fingers hovered motionless above the keyboard. That didn't make sense. Camille never handled financial operations. She avoided spreadsheets the way most people avoided tax audits. Which meant one of two things. Either she approved something she didn't understand, or she approved something she shouldn't have. I stood slowly and turned toward my father's office again. He looked up as I entered. There's a vendor I need clarification on, I said calmly. He stiffened almost immediately. What vendor? He asked. I named it. His jaw tightened. We've been working with them for some time, he replied quickly. Why Nevada? I asked. He hesitated, just long enough. Supply chain diversification, he answered. Deflection, not explanation. And Camille's approval signature, I added. His eyes darkened. That's not relevant right now, he snapped. Not relevant? The words echoed sharply inside my mind, because they were exactly what someone says when something matters too much to discuss. Later, as I stepped back into the hallway, Lewis approached quietly. Too quietly. You should be careful, he whispered, his voice barely audible. I turned toward him. Careful of what? I asked. He swallowed hard, eyes darting toward the surrounding offices. What files you open? He said. Then he walked away quickly before I could respond. The warning settled deep in my chest like cold metal. That night, long after most employees had gone home, I remained alone inside the office. The building felt different after dark. Quieter. More dangerous. I scrolled through one final directory, a hidden folder buried deep within archived transfers. Executive Reserve transfers. I opened it slowly. Line after line filled the screen. Transfers routed through multiple accounts, layered carefully, structured intentionally. The total amounts climbed higher with every entry I reviewed. Too high to be accidental. Too precise to be careless. This wasn't mismanagement. This wasn't oversight. This was theft. And as I stared at those numbers glowing against the dark screen, one truth settled heavily into my chest. Someone inside this family hadn't just made a mistake. They had built a system to steal. The office felt smaller after midnight, like the walls had crept inward while I wasn't looking. Only the desk lamp lit the room, casting long shadows across stacks of paper and glowing screens. The rest of the factory sat in darkness, quiet except for the distant hum of machines cooling down for the night. I leaned closer to the monitor, scrolling slowly through the vendor logs again. Something about the numbers still bothered me. Not obvious at first glance. Not something anyone without training would notice. But once you saw it, you couldn't unsee it. Invoice numbers, repeating in strange intervals. Every fourth entry shared the same internal formatting code, same suffix, same structural pattern buried beneath slightly altered digits. Too clean. Too consistent. I grabbed a notepad and began writing down the sequences manually, lining them up side by side. When I finished, the pattern became undeniable. These invoices weren't random. They were engineered. My pulse picked up slightly as I opened the vendor details again. The address listed for the primary vendor appeared on every suspicious transfer. Reno, Nevada. I opened a new tab and searched property records tied to the address. The screen loaded slowly. Then an image appeared. Satellite view. An empty warehouse. Dust-covered parking lot. No delivery trucks. No signage. Nothing. No active business. No shipments. No employees. Just an abandoned building sitting alone in a wide stretch of cracked asphalt. A shell. A ghost company. My stomach tightened. This wasn't sloppy bookkeeping. This was fraud. The word settled heavily into my thoughts, colder than anything I'd felt since walking back into this building. Morning came too quickly. The factory lights flickered on one by one, employees filing in with tired expressions and quiet voices. I carried printed documents toward Lewis's desk, watching him carefully as I approached. He noticed the papers immediately. His face lost color. "Can we talk?" I asked calmly. He swallowed once and nodded. We moved into a small side office, closing the door behind us. The air inside felt stale, heavy with tension. I placed the printed satellite image on the desk between us. "You recognize this address?" I asked. He stared at it without speaking. Silence stretched, long enough to feel uncomfortable. "I need you to tell me the truth," I continued quietly. "Who approved payments to this vendor?" His jaw tightened. "I just process entries," he said weakly. I slid the second document forward, a list of matching invoice patterns. "These were intentional," I said. "Someone instructed you not to question them." His shoulders dropped slightly. That was the moment he broke. "I was told not to ask questions," he whispered. "Executive level." The words landed hard. Executive level, meaning someone above him. Someone with authority. Someone with protection. "Who told you?" I asked. He shook his head quickly. "I can't," he said. "You don't understand what you're walking into. Fear. Real fear. Not caution. Not hesitation. Fear. That told me more than any name could." Later that morning, I moved into the archive room, unlocking cabinets that hadn't been opened in years. Dust clung to the edges of old backup drives stacked neatly on metal shelves. I wiped one clean with my sleeve and connected it to my workstation. Files loaded slowly. Older records. Older transactions. Older patterns. My breath slowed as the timeline stretched backward across the screen. And then I saw it. The pattern wasn't new. It hadn't started recently. It had started years ago. Before the wedding. Before I left. Before I ever questioned missing ledgers. My heart pounded harder now. That meant something I hadn't allowed myself to consider before. This wasn't something that began after I walked away. This existed while I was still inside the company. Which meant, maybe I hadn't left voluntarily. Maybe I had been pushed. A chill slid through me at the thought. I opened another set of files, deeper layers. Restricted categories buried under coded labels. One section caught my attention immediately. Special contribution routing. The wording alone made my stomach tighten. I opened the folder. Rows of transactions filled the screen, each routed through multiple intermediary accounts before reaching final destinations. I followed the trail carefully. Account to account. Transfer to transfer. Until finally, the final recipients appeared. Political action committees. Not vendors. Not suppliers. Political organizations. Illegal ones. Money laundering disguised as operational expenses. The realization struck hard enough to steal my breath. This wasn't internal fraud. This was federal-level crime. Serious crime. Crime that destroyed companies. Destroyed families. Destroyed lives. My hands trembled slightly as I scrolled further. Then I saw it. A signature. Digital approval stamp. My father's name. Clear. Undeniable. For a long moment, I just stared. Because something about it didn't make sense. My father rarely handled detailed financial approvals. He delegated, trusted others to manage specifics. Which meant one of two things. Either he knowingly approved illegal transfers, or someone manipulated him into doing it. The sound of movement outside pulled my attention away. Voices. Urgent ones. I stepped into the hallway just as two dark sedans pulled into the front lot. Men in suits stepped out. Badges flashed briefly under sunlight. Federal investigators. The air inside the building changed instantly. Phones rang louder. Voices rose. Doors slammed shut. Panic spread faster than fire. Inside the executive conference room, my parents sat with several senior staff members, faces tight with anxiety. My father paced along the far wall, running his hand through his hair repeatedly. My mother clutched a tissue between trembling fingers. Everyone spoke at once. Blame flew through the room like sharp glass. Who approved these transfers? Why weren't we warned? Who knew about this? Through it all, my father avoided looking directly at me. That alone confirmed something deep inside my chest. He knew more than he was admitting. Later, after the room emptied and silence returned, I stood alone near the tall windows overlooking the factory floor. Workers moved below like shadows, unaware of how close everything stood to collapse. I replayed everything in my mind. The missing ledger, the shell company, the political routing, the signatures. Then another realization settled in slowly. Investigators didn't have everything yet. They had suspicions, fragments, pieces. But I had the full picture. I held information they hadn't seen. Information that could destroy this company completely. Or save it. That was the moment the weight of power settled onto my shoulders. Not anger. Not revenge. Responsibility. My computer chimed again behind me. Another email. Same unknown sender. I opened it immediately. One line appeared on the screen. They're coming for the records next. An attachment followed. I opened it. A list filled the screen. Accounts marked in red. Priority destruction. My pulse surged. Someone inside this company wasn't just hiding evidence. They were planning to erase it. And as I stared at those red-marked accounts glowing in the darkness of the screen, one truth became impossible to ignore. This wasn't just fraud anymore. It was survival. Phones started ringing before sunrise. Sharp and relentless. Echoing through the hallways like alarm bells no one could silence. By the time I stepped into the main office, The tension was already thick enough to feel in the air. Employees clustered near desks, whispering urgently. Screens flickered with frozen transactions and blinking error messages. Then the finance manager burst through the conference room door. Breathless, eyes wide. "All accounts are frozen," he said. The words landed like thunder. For a moment, no one spoke. Then chaos began. "What do you mean frozen?" someone demanded. "Payroll won't process," he replied quickly. "Suppliers are rejecting our purchase orders. Nothing is moving." My father stood near the head of the table, gripping the edge of the chair so tightly his knuckles turned white. "How long?" he asked. "No timeline yet." The finance manager said, "Federal hold." The room fell silent again. But this time it wasn't stillness, it was fear. Outside, machines began shutting down one by one. The sound of production slowing echoed through the building like a heartbeat fading. I stepped into the factory floor minutes later, needing to see the damage with my own eyes. Workers gathered in small groups, speaking in hushed tones. Some leaned against machinery. Others stood motionless beside silent conveyor belts. One older employee, a man who had worked here since before I joined, stepped forward carefully. "Are we losing our jobs?" he asked. The question hit harder than anything else that morning. Not because I had caused this, but because truth always punished the innocent first. "I don't know yet," I answered honestly. He nodded slowly, absorbing the uncertainty like it was already expected. That look stayed with me as I returned to the executive office. Inside, tension had turned into accusation. Voices overlapped. Fingers pointed. Panic grew louder by the second. My mother sat near the window, crying quietly into a tissue. My father paced back and forth like a caged animal, frustration radiating from every step. Then suddenly, he stopped, turned, and looked straight at me. "This happened because you came back," he said sharply. The room went silent again. Every eye shifted toward me. "You should have stayed away," he added. For a brief second, anger surged through me, hot, immediate, dangerous. But I didn't react. Instead, I watched, because I had seen this pattern before. Blame as defense. Deflection as survival. "You're wrong," I said quietly, not loud. Not emotional, just calm. That calm unsettled him more than anger ever could. Later, when the room emptied and silence returned, he called me into his office. The door shut behind us with a heavy click. For several seconds, neither of us spoke. Then I placed a folder onto his desk. Political routing records, transfer chains, shell company documentation. He stared at the papers without touching them. "You knew about this," I said. Not a question. A statement. He exhaled slowly, lowering himself into his chair like the weight of the world had finally settled onto his shoulders. "I signed what they told me to sign," he admitted quietly. The words surprised me, not because of what he said, but because of how tired he sounded. "They said it would stabilize the company," he continued. "Temporary adjustments, emergency funding." Miniature tremors ran through his fingers as they rested against the desk. "I didn't understand what it really was," he added. For the first time in years, he didn't sound powerful. He sounded afraid. "Who told you?" I asked. He hesitated, looked away, then spoke a single name. The moment I heard it, the air left my lungs. Marcus Hale, my former mentor, the man who trained me during my first years in finance, the man who taught me how to recognize financial patterns, the man who told me once that numbers never lied. Memories surged instantly. Late nights reviewing ledgers, his steady voice explaining risk models, his confidence guiding decisions. He had built the system I once trusted, which meant he could build a system designed to hide. Shock settled deep inside my chest. Not just betrayal, personal betrayal. He had access to everything. My father continued quietly. He convinced investors, managed external contacts, said he knew how to protect us. Protect. The word felt bitter now, after leaving his office. I stepped outside into the cold morning air, needing distance from the walls closing in around me. The wind hit my face sharply, grounding me. I replayed every discovery so far. Shell companies, political routing, missing ledgers, threat emails. Then something else became clear. The investigators didn't know everything yet. They had fragments, but I had the full chain. Complete transaction logs, hidden backups, encrypted records I had stored years earlier, files no one else even knew existed. That realization changed everything. Power didn't belong to my father. Not anymore. Power belonged to whoever controlled the truth. And right now, that was me. Later that afternoon, tension spread through the office again when Camille's name surfaced in conversation. "Has anyone heard from her?" my mother asked quietly. Silence answered. No calls, no messages, no updates. She knew something, my mother whispered suddenly, her voice trembling. Those words settled heavily in my chest. Because Camille's disappearance no longer felt random. It felt intentional, like escape. Night fell slowly, shadows stretching long across empty desks as employees left one by one. I remained behind, alone. The glow of my computer screen illuminated the room as I connected an external encrypted drive, one I had carried quietly for years without fully understanding why. Files appeared instantly. Full transaction logs. Unedited. Unfiltered. More than anyone else inside this building had ever seen. Two paths formed clearly in my mind. Give everything to investigators immediately, destroy the company completely. Or control the release of truth, protect innocent workers while exposing the guilty. Justice. Not destruction. That was the difference. The phone rang suddenly, slicing through the silence. Unknown number. I hesitated only a second before answering. Hello? Silence lingered on the line. Then a familiar voice spoke, calm, steady, unmistakable. I hear you're asking dangerous questions. Marcus Hale. The sound of his voice sent a cold ripple down my spine. Not fear. Recognition. You taught me to ask the right ones, I replied. A low chuckle echoed through the receiver. You always were sharp, he said. But sharp tools can be dangerous, especially when pointed in the wrong direction. The warning wasn't subtle. It wasn't polite. It was a threat. And as his voice faded into silence, one truth settled into place with terrifying clarity. This wasn't just about saving my family anymore. It was about confronting the man who taught me everything I knew. Sleep never really came that night. I lay awake in the small guest room above the factory office, staring at the ceiling while Marcus Hale's voice replayed in my head over and over again. I hear you're asking dangerous questions. Not anger. Not panic. Confidence. That was what unsettled me most. He believed I would stay silent. Believed I would hesitate. Believed I would protect the very system he built. That assumption became my advantage. By morning, my mind felt sharper than it had in years. Clear. Focused. Strategic. When I stepped into the conference room, 2 federal investigators were already seated at the long wooden table. Their folders were open, notes spread neatly in front of them. They didn't look surprised to see me. They looked prepared. Miss Whitaker, one of them said, standing slightly as I entered. Thank you for meeting with us. His voice carried calm authority, not accusation. That alone told me something important. They needed answers, and they suspected I could provide them. I understand you're reviewing internal financial records. The second investigator added. I replied evenly, taking the chair across from them. A quiet moment passed. Then the first investigator leaned forward slightly. We believe illegal financial routing occurred within this company, he said. But we are still missing several links in the chain. Missing pieces. That was the phrase that settled heavily in my chest. Because I had those pieces, locked safely in encrypted files, hidden for years. You want access to internal records? I said. Yes. Complete access. Yes. I folded my hands together slowly, forcing myself to remain calm. Because this moment mattered. This was where power shifted. "I'm willing to cooperate," I said carefully. "But I have conditions." Both men exchanged brief glances. "What kind of conditions?" One asked. "Innocent employees are protected," I said. "People who followed instructions but didn't create this system." Silence filled the room for a moment. Then one of them nodded. "That's reasonable." And, I added, "I present the findings personally." That second condition surprised them. I saw it in their eyes. But they didn't argue. "Agreed," the lead investigator replied. "Respect." That was what settled into the air between us then. Not suspicion. Not dismissal. Respect. Later that afternoon, I sat alone in the records room, building what would become the most important presentation of my life. Stacks of documents surrounded me. Vendor logs, routing chains, digital signatures, transaction timelines. Every file organized with precision, every detail verified twice. Years ago, my father humiliated me publicly in front of 200 guests. Tonight, I would answer publicly, not with emotion, but with truth. Hours passed without interruption, until finally, the boardroom filled. Family members arrived first. My mother sat near the corner, gripping tissues between trembling fingers. My father stood near the head of the table, shoulders stiff, refusing to look directly at me. Lawyers lined one wall. Investigators stood silently near the door. The atmosphere felt eerily familiar. Too familiar. Like standing in that wedding hall again, surrounded by witnesses, waiting for judgment. Except this time, I held the truth. I connected my laptop to the display screen. The room darkened slightly as the presentation loaded. These are internal transaction patterns spanning 8 years. I began calmly. My voice didn't shake, didn't falter. Confidence carried each word forward. I walked them through the chain step by step. Vendor shells, political routing, hidden transfers. Every movement of money mapped clearly across the screen. No speculation, no guessing, just facts. The room fell silent as I spoke. Not uncomfortable silence. Respectful silence. The same silence that once followed my father's accusations, but this time, it carried weight in my favor. One of the investigators stepped forward and reviewed several documents carefully. Then he nodded. "This matches federal findings," he confirmed. That moment shifted everything. Not gradually. Instantly. The truth had weight now. Authority. Reality. My father remained motionless until the final document appeared. His own digital authorization tied to early transfers. Slowly, he lifted his head. His eyes finally met mine. Not angry. Not defensive. Tired. Deeply tired. "I owe you an apology," he said quietly. The room stilled completely. "For what happened years ago," he continued. "And for what happened at the wedding?" His voice cracked slightly. "Naomi didn't abandon this family," he said. Louder now. "We failed her." The words echoed across the room like thunder. Public. Clear. Undeniable. 6 years ago, he had destroyed my reputation in front of strangers. Now he rebuilt it in front of witnesses. Balance restored. Not perfectly, but enough. The room slowly began to disperse after investigators finalized their notes. I stepped into the hallway, breathing deeply for the first time in hours. And that was when I saw her, Camille, standing near the far wall. Alive. Present. Waiting. Shock hit first. Then anger. Then confusion. "You disappeared," I said quietly. She nodded once. Her face pale. "I didn't know how to face you," she admitted. Silence stretched between us. "You knew about the transfers," I said. Her eyes filled instantly. "I found them months before the auditors," she whispered. "Marcus threatened me. Said if I spoke, everything would collapse. Fear. Not betrayal. Fear. I thought staying quiet would protect everyone." She continued weakly. Her voice trembled under the weight of regret. I studied her carefully. Years ago, her silence had felt like betrayal. Now, it looked like weakness. Human weakness. Not cruelty, Later that evening, investigators approached me once more. "There's an opportunity here," one of them said carefully. "With your expertise, you could take leadership inside the company moving forward. Leadership, control, authority. Everything my old self once chased." For a moment, the offer lingered in the air. Tempting. Powerful? Then I shook my head slowly. "No," I replied. They exchanged brief glances. "You're certain?" "I didn't come back to rebuild the same life," I said. "I came back to reclaim my own—" That answer surprised even me. But it felt right. Deeply right. Later, as the sun dipped low beyond the factory windows, I stood alone watching the light fade across the rooftops. My phone buzzed softly in my hand. A message from the investigators. "Charges will be filed tomorrow. Simple, final, unavoidable." 6 years ago, I walked out of a ballroom humiliated and alone. Tomorrow, truth would walk forward without fear, and as the last sunlight disappeared beyond the factory roof, one thought settled quietly in my mind. The woman standing here now was not the same woman who once walked away. Cold morning air settled against my skin as I stood across the street from the federal courthouse, watching the heavy doors open and close with steady rhythm. People moved in and out, attorneys carrying briefcases, reporters adjusting cameras, officers speaking into radios. The entire scene felt tense but controlled, like something long expected was finally unfolding. I pulled my coat tighter around me and stepped closer to the barricade. Then I saw him, Marcus Hale. 2 officers escorted him through the courthouse doors. Metal cuffs locked around his wrists. His posture remained stiff, his expression tight. But the confidence I remembered from years ago had vanished. Reporters surged forward instantly. Cameras flashed. Questions shouted across the cold air. "Mr. Hale, do you have a statement? Did you knowingly authorize illegal transfers?" He didn't answer. Didn't look toward the crowd. But for one brief second, his gaze shifted outward and landed on me. Recognition flickered across his face. Then regret. Or maybe fear. I couldn't tell the difference anymore. Surprisingly, I didn't feel triumph. No surge of victory. No satisfaction. Just stillness. Justice. I realized. Wasn't loud. It was quiet. Heavy. Final. Weeks passed slowly after that day. The factory didn't close. Despite early fears, investigators worked carefully, separating innocent employees from those directly responsible. One by one, restrictions lifted. Limited transactions resumed. Machines returned to operation. The first time I walked through the factory floor again after the accounts reopened, the sound of machinery running felt different. Hopeful? Cautious. Alive. Workers greeted each other with quiet smiles, relief visible in tired eyes. Some nodded when they saw me. Others offered simple words of gratitude as they passed. "Thank you for staying," one woman whispered softly as she moved past me. I didn't respond immediately, because gratitude felt complicated. I hadn't stayed for them at first. I had stayed for truth. But truth had protected them in the end. And that mattered. A month later, the board gathered again inside the executive conference room. The atmosphere was formal, heavy with quiet understanding. My father stood at the front of the table, hands resting flat against the polished surface. He looked older now, not physically fragile, but worn in ways success had once hidden. "I am stepping down as acting director," he announced slowly. His voice carried no resistance, no denial, only acceptance. "Mistakes were made under my leadership," he continued, "and I take responsibility for allowing the wrong people too much influence." The room remained silent, not judgmental, respectful. I watched him closely as he finished speaking. 6 years ago, he had held power with confidence. Now he released it with humility. That shift felt larger than any courtroom verdict. Later that afternoon, I stepped outside the factory entrance just as the sun dipped low across the horizon. Footsteps approached quietly behind me. I didn't need to turn to know it was him. "Naomi," my father said softly. I faced him slowly. For several seconds. Neither of us spoke. Then he exhaled deeply. I was afraid, he admitted. The words caught me off guard. Afraid of losing everything we built, he continued. Afraid of failure. And in that fear, I pushed away the one person who might have saved us sooner. His voice trembled slightly. I should never have spoken to you the way I did at the wedding, he added. The memory returned instantly. The microphone. The silence. The weight of strangers staring. But something had changed. The pain wasn't sharp anymore. It was distant. Manageable. I forgive you, I said quietly. His eyes lifted toward mine. But forgiveness doesn't mean returning to what existed before, I added gently. He nodded once. Understanding settled between us without further explanation. Not perfect reconciliation, but honest closure. A few days later, I met Camille at a small cafe near the courthouse. She looked thinner than I remembered, exhaustion visible in the shadows beneath her eyes. I should have spoken sooner, she admitted quietly, wrapping both hands around her coffee cup. I saw the transfers before everything collapsed. I studied her carefully. Fear still lingered in her expression. I thought silence would protect everyone, she whispered. It protected no one, I replied softly. Tears formed in her eyes. I almost called you back then, she admitted. More times than I can count. The confession didn't erase the past, but it softened something sharp inside me. We didn't hug when we parted, didn't promise future closeness. But the anger that once lived between us had faded into something quieter. Distance. Acceptance. Months later, my life looked nothing like it once had. A new office stood on the second floor of a small brick building in Spokane. Sunlight poured through wide windows each morning, warming the polished desk that now held my name in clear lettering. Naomi Whitaker Consulting. My name, my work, my independence. Clients filled my schedule steadily, companies seeking clarity, guidance, protection from mistakes they didn't yet understand. One afternoon, while reviewing documents near the window, my gaze drifted toward the skyline beyond the glass. For a brief moment, memory carried me backward. Back to that ballroom. Back to the moment everything changed. A few weeks later, I returned there, alone. The ballroom sat empty now, stripped of decorations and celebration. No music played. No laughter filled the air. Just silence. I walked slowly toward the center of the room, stopping at the exact spot where I once stood frozen beneath 200 watchful eyes. For a moment, I closed my eyes. The memory replayed. My father gripping the microphone. Guests whispering. My mother calling me too sensitive. But when I opened my eyes again, something had shifted. That memory no longer controlled me. It belonged to the past. Not the present. Not the future. 6 years ago, I walked out of this room alone, humiliated and uncertain. Today, I stood here again, steady, certain, whole. Leaving that night hadn't been weakness. It had been survival. Preparation. The first step toward becoming someone stronger. Later that evening, I stepped onto my apartment balcony, city lights glowing softly beneath the fading sky. My phone buzzed gently in my hand. A message appeared from one of the factory employees. Thank you for saving our jobs. I read the message twice before setting the phone down. Not because I needed praise, but because it confirmed something deeper. Justice wasn't revenge. Justice was restoration. I leaned against the railing, breathing in the cool night air. 6 years ago, silence nearly erased me. Today, truth rebuilt everything. And if you've ever walked away from a place that made you feel small, if you've ever been told you were too sensitive, too emotional, or too weak simply because you refused to stay silent, then you understand what it means to choose dignity over approval. Stories like this aren't just about revenge. They're about finding your voice again after betrayal. So, if this story reminded you of your own strength, or of a moment when you chose yourself even when it hurt, share your thoughts below. Tell me what you would have done in my place. And if you believe that sometimes the bravest thing a person can do is walk away, rebuild, and come back stronger, stay here. Subscribe. There are more stories waiting, stories about family, betrayal, justice, and the quiet power of choosing yourself. Because sometimes the loudest victory in life is the quiet moment when you finally decide you are worth protecting.